And we did want to take tonight as a special time just to remember what Jesus came to earth to accomplish for us. But we also wanted to keep it short so that you can get on to your Christmas traditions. And we know that different families have many different Christmas traditions. And like many people do, Janie and I, what our Christmas tradition is, and this is very basic, probably everyone does this, is that one year we like to spend with my family, one year we like to spend with her family, and we alternate that way. And like many of you that have already done so or will do so, Janie and I will soon be traveling back up to New Jersey to spend Christmas with family. And inevitably, right, what always happens when we gather with family, and especially when we're gathered around the dinner table, there comes a time where we begin to rehash stories of the past, right? You remember those conversations when you're gathered with family, those conversations that begin with, hey, remember when? And then you tell a story to purposefully, and in good fun, right, mock another family member. And there's one story in particular that my parents like to tell. I think that they think it's funny. And it's a story about when I was about 5 years old or so. And apparently at that age, I didn't like being alone. Maybe it was that I didn't like being alone at all, or I didn't like being alone in a particular room. I don't really know. It strikes me as odd because I have no problem being alone anymore. But one day, my parents, so they say that I came up to them and that I asked them if they could go into the back room with me. Apparently, I didn't want to go by myself. And their response to me was, well, you can go alone, you'll be fine. To which I replied, but I'm afraid to go back there by myself. Don't worry, they said, Jesus will be with you. As a 5-year-old, I thought about that for a moment. And I said, that's true. I said, but me and Jesus are both scared, and we need you to come with us. I will say as a 5-year-old, obviously I did not have the most sound theology, but my parents were trying to teach me something that was important for me to understand. They wanted me to understand that there is nothing to be afraid of if the special presence of the Lord is with you. From a young age, they wanted me to know that even in a chaotic world, if God's special presence is with you, you can live a blessed life. And just a few moments ago, the teens read for us Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 to 23, which is our focus for this evening. And I'm sure at that point in Joseph's life, he was afraid that there were a number of things to be afraid about. But unlike me, who was afraid of really nothing, he was afraid for legitimate reasons. He was betrothed and committed to marrying a godly woman, and he finds out that she is pregnant out of nowhere. Well, how could that be? Well, there's really only one way, right? And that's that if Mary had been unfaithful. Well, he couldn't marry her now, I'm sure he thought to himself, but neither did he want to publicly break their engagement to one another, because that would devastate Mary's life. After all, he still loved her, and that hadn't changed, and he didn't want to hurt her. And so he made plans. Hey, how about if I quietly dissolve our betrothal? That is until an angel visits Joseph, and that angel tells him that Mary hadn't done anything wrong. As a matter of fact, she is favored, because that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Ghost. And the angel continues to tell him that this child that will be born will be a son, and this son will save his people from their sins. At that moment, I'm sure that Joseph's mind rushed back to Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14, which says, behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and she shall call his name Emmanuel. Because long ago, Isaiah had given a prophecy to King Ahaz. And he told King Ahaz that even though King Ahaz had forsaken the Lord, that the Lord would never forsake his promises. And regardless of Ahaz's disobedience and his stubbornness, God would preserve his promise by preserving the Davidic line of the Messiah. And so he prophesied to Ahaz that one day there would be born a son, And this son would fulfill all of the messianic promises. And the sign of this prophecy's fulfillment would be this, that a virgin would conceive and bear a child, and that child would be Emmanuel. And Matthew provides some context for us because he knows that his readers probably don't know what that means, and he says Emmanuel means God with us. And so by faith, Joseph believed that the Lord's special presence was with them. Instead of being afraid, I'm sure he must have become excited, because for thousands of years they had been waiting, and now it was happening. The Messiah had come, and it was better than any man could have imagined, because the Messiah was not just a man, but it was God with us. God's special presence had finally come to live among his people. That's what Emmanuel means. It means God's special presence. And it's God's special presence among us. That's what makes Christmas so significant, isn't it? Because Emmanuel is not just another empty holiday promise. Emmanuel is not the promise of somebody breaking into your house and leaving gifts. Emmanuel is not the promise of a beautifully decorated gingerbread house. Emmanuel is not the promise of earthly gifts or earthly sentiment, which will inevitably be forgotten. Emmanuel is not about any of those things. Emmanuel is about God's presence with us. Because you see, Christmas is the fulfillment of the oldest promise that there is. A promise that the people of God have always held dear and close to their hearts. The promise that one day it would be possible for man to be reunited with God. God with us. In many ways, throughout human history, the wait for Emmanuel has shaped history. And tonight I want to consider the coming of Emmanuel from two different perspectives. One, from man's perspective, as the people of God waited and waited and waited for Emmanuel. And then from the other perspective, which is God's, as God was throughout history purposefully and intentionally drawing closer and closer to his people. So first, let's consider man's wait for Emmanuel. Since the Garden of Eden, since the fall of man, God's people have been waiting for God to provide a way back into his presence. By taking of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Adam and Eve, what they decided to do was they decided to walk out of the presence of God. They decided that they knew what was right more than God knew what was right. They decided that they would rather do what is right in their own eyes than trust God. And because they had rejected God and rejected God's goodness, they had to. It was necessary for them to leave the Garden of Eden and leave God's special presence with them. However, God had made a promise that he would not just leave them without his presence. In Genesis 3:15, God promised that there would be continual conflict from this point forward between the forces of Satan and the seed of the woman. And although satanic forces would do significant damage to the woman's seed, ultimately there would come one of the woman, and this one would crush the head of the serpent. This one would deal a fatal blow to all of the satanic forces. And from that moment on, God's people waited for that one man. Who will bring us back into the presence of God? Well, Adam and Eve, they have a son, and they name him Cain. And the woman, Eve, seeing that the Lord had given her a son, said, "I've acquired a man from the Lord." Apparently, Eve thought that Cain would be the one to come and to crush the head of the serpent. But then she has another son named Abel. Maybe Abel? And we know it's neither one of them, because Cain killed Abel, and Cain ended up being cursed by God, so it had to be somebody else. They knew it would be a man, but which one? Well, Adam and Eve had another son named Seth. And again, Eve says, "For God has appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed." And so she says, maybe the seed that will come and crush the head of the serpent, maybe it's Seth. But Seth doesn't reconcile anyone to God. In fact, as you read Genesis 5 tells us that the descendants of Seth continue one after the other, generation after generation after generation, to march towards death. So it's not Seth. And Genesis 5 tells us that this happens generation after generation, and it's not until Lamech has a son named Noah that the idea of a seed comes back again. And Lamech says, this one will comfort us concerning our work and the toil of our hands because of the ground which the Lord has cursed. Maybe Noah will deliver us from the curse. Maybe Noah will bring us back into the presence of God. But we know that Noah didn't redeem man. As a matter of fact, in Noah's day, the Bible tells us in Genesis 6 that the forces of evil, the forces of Satan, had become so active and so powerful that every intent of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. And so instead, everyone in Noah's day drowns. Because like Cain, the people in Noah's day had fallen prey to the serpent. Noah was preserved, but the reason Noah was preserved was to preserve the promise that God gave to Eve, that one day there would be a seed and that man would bring them back into the presence of God. So it wasn't Noah, and mankind continues to wait. God does, however, tell Noah that the seed of the woman will eventually come from one of his sons, obviously, because everyone else is drowned. But he will come from Shem. And in Genesis 12, we're introduced to Abraham, a son of Shem. Maybe Abraham will bring man back to God. Maybe Abraham will reconcile man to God. After all, God promised him, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Maybe Abraham. God does say, after all, that all the nations will be blessed through him. But as we continue and we follow the life of Abraham, we know it's not Abraham because Abraham's life is marked by deceit. So it's not Abraham. Maybe it's Isaac. Not Isaac. Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau, and the promise is passed down to Jacob, but we know that the man that's going to do this is not Jacob because Jacob is a liar and a deceiver. Well, Jacob has 12 sons, and the promise is passed down to Judah in Genesis 49, verse 10, but it's not Judah. And if you've read Genesis 38, you know it's definitely not Judah. And so centuries pass, about 400 years, and another leader comes. And he comes and he leads his people out of slavery in Egypt, and he's a great leader. His name is Moses. And people propose, maybe it's Moses. I mean, he's led us out of slavery. He's brought us blessing from God. Maybe it's Moses. But Moses says in Deuteronomy chapter 18 and verse 15, the Lord your God shall raise for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brethren, him you shall hear. And so we know it's not Moses because Moses says it's not me. That's a pretty good indication. The seed, Moses says, will be somebody like me, somebody who delivers you, but it's not me. And so another 4 centuries pass, and they're still looking for that man. They know it will be a man, but who? And God commands Samuel to anoint a king to replace Saul. And God tells Samuel, and he directs him to the house of Jesse, who is of the house of Judah. So maybe it's this one. And God directs Samuel to anoint David. Will David, the son of Judah, bring people back to God? No, because we find out in 2 Samuel 11 that even though David is a man of faith and a hero, he is marked by sin as well. However, David receives the promise in 2 Samuel 7 that the seed will come through him. As a matter of fact, the prophets so closely associate Emmanuel, the one who will bring us back into the presence of God with David, that Ezekiel says in Ezekiel 34:23, I will establish one shepherd over them, and he shall feed them, my servant David. So we know it's going to come from David, and he shall feed them and be their shepherd. And again, Ezekiel says in Ezekiel 37:24, David, my servant, shall be king over them. But it's not David. And the people of God, longing to be back in the presence of God, wait another 400 years. And no one has come to be God with us. No one has come to bring man back into the presence of God. And we begin to ask, perhaps this is too great a task for man to accomplish. What man can reconcile mankind to God? Will man ever be able to enter back into the presence of God? According to Genesis 3:15, we know it must be a man, but who can do this? And it's at that moment that God sends a prophecy to Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 9 that this son will be born, the seed of the woman, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And so, yes, it is true that the son that will come and bring them back into the presence of God will be a man, but he will also be Mighty God, Emmanuel, God with us. And when he comes, he will be born not of the seed of man, but of a virgin, the seed of the woman. And so by the end of the Old Testament, God's people are waiting and hoping and praying, God, please send somebody to bring us back into your presence, waiting for Emmanuel. But as they were waiting, some of the Israelites noticed, but not all, that as they were waiting, God was doing his own work in drawing closer and closer to his people. And so secondly, I want to take a look tonight at God's plan for Emmanuel. And as we've already observed, God's promise of a son was passed from Seth all the way down to David. It was a promise that spanned hundreds of years. But even while man waited for Emmanuel, God still desired to be with his people. And so this is why he instructs Moses, build for me a tabernacle. And in Exodus, once Moses finishes constructing the tabernacle, God's holy presence fills it. Once he consecrates the tabernacle, we see in Exodus 40, verse 34, that the cloud covered the tabernacle of meeting and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In Exodus 40:38, for the cloud of the Lord was above the tabernacle by day, and fire was over it by night in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. And so the tabernacle was a place where God would be with his people. He lived among his people. He spoke to his people. And yet the tabernacle was temporary. And God desired to be with his people forever. And so about 400 years after the building of the tabernacle, he instructs Solomon, build a temple for me that I may live among my people permanently. And again, as soon as the temple was completed and consecrated, God's holy presence fills it. The Bible tells us in 2 Chronicles 5:13 and 14, indeed it came to pass, when the trumpeters and the singers were as one, to make one sound to be heard in praising and thanking the Lord, and when they had lifted up their voice with the trumpets and cymbals and the instruments of music and praising the Lord, saying, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever, that the house of the Lord was filled with a cloud, so that the priests could not continue ministering because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house. Now the Lord no longer lived in a tent temporarily, but he lived among his people permanently. Maybe this is what God means. That he will raise up people to build a house for him, that he will be with his people. Yet according to Jeremiah chapter 2, verses 13 and 14, the people, even though God lives among them, still commit the same evils that they always have, walking away from the presence of the Lord and into the arms of man-made idols. Their hearts, Jeremiah says, are desperately wicked. And even despite all that God has done to be with them, to be near them, to be among them, they still keep trying to walk away from his presence. And so it becomes blatantly clear at this point in the Bible that they needed more than a man to bring them to God. They needed more than God living in a house among them. They needed to be changed from the inside out. They needed, according to Jeremiah, a new heart. They needed to be brought from death to life. They needed not just God among them, but God in them. They needed to be made into new creatures. And so from the consecration of the temple, another 1,000 years pass. And then suddenly, an angel visits, of all people, a carpenter named Joseph and tells him, do not fear, God's special presence, Emmanuel, is with Mary. The child that she has is the man. He is the seed. He is the promise. He is God with us. He is the one that will save his people from their sins. He is from Shem. He is from Abraham, from Isaac, from Jacob, from Judah. He is from, most significantly, David. Jesus was born of the woman, a virgin, God with us. He was the one that would bring man back to God. According to John chapter 1, just as God's presence filled the tabernacle and just as God's presence filled the temple, God's presence came and filled human flesh and was God with us. The Word took on flesh and dwelt among us. The word dwelt has the same idea as the tabernacle, that the presence of God filled this person, Jesus. Jesus was not just the seed of the woman, but he was God living among his people. But just like the tabernacle and just like the temple, his work wasn't done. Just as it wasn't enough for God to live in a tabernacle or a temple, it wasn't enough for Jesus. He wanted to be even closer to his people. He wanted not just to live among his people, but to live in them. This is why Jesus, as his crucifixion and as his departure came closer and closer, Jesus said to his disciples, "And I will pray the Father, and he will give you another helper. He will give you somebody of the same kind, being, and quality as me. He will send my Spirit to be with you." And so Jesus, God with us, went to Calvary, and there the promised seed of the woman crushed the head of the serpent forever. He was the man who was more than a man. And from before the foundation of the world, this was God's plan. For what purpose? Why did Jesus come? So that man could be with God. Emmanuel, God with us. But even as Jesus crushed the head of the serpent, just as Jesus had said, that wasn't the end of his plan. After Jesus' ascension up back into heaven, as believers waited for this comforter, when that day did come, just as God's presence filled the tabernacle, just as it filled the temple, and just like the tabernacle and temple, where the cloud and the fire appeared over the tabernacle and the temple, on the day of Pentecost, the fire appears as if it were tongues of fire over believers on that day, signifying this, that God no longer lives among his people, but God lives in his people, drawing closer to his people than ever before. And how was this done? It was done because of Jesus. It was done because of Christmas. According to 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 22, the Spirit of God in us is now the guarantee. The guarantee of what? That one day you will be physically in the presence of God. The presence of God in us is the guarantee that one day we will be with him physically. No longer just spiritually, but physically as well. Emmanuel, God with us, the oldest promise in all the world, that God would redeem his people and bring them back into his presence. You know, when you strip everything else away, that is what gives Christmas its significance. God sent his Son so that where he is, there we may be also. And when you strip Christmas of all the stories and all the characters and all the decorations, you find Christmas in its most powerful form. What is the purpose of Christmas? And it's powerful and it's simple. God wants to be with us. And so he sent his Son to accomplish that. God made a way for us to be with him. That's the power. That's the story. That's the reality of Christmas.